On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was found unresponsive on the floor of his bathroom at Graceland. He was rushed to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis, where doctors worked to revive him for nearly half an hour before he was pronounced dead at 3:30 p.m. He was 42 years old. Within hours, the death of the most famous entertainer in the world had become a global event. Crowds gathered outside the hospital and later outside Graceland itself, and the pressure on the small circle of people responsible for Elvis's body was immense. Behind closed doors, away from the cameras, two very different processes were unfolding at once. One was medical, a formal autopsy meant to determine, officially, what had killed him. The other was far more private, the quiet human work of preparing his body for a public viewing that millions of grieving fans would never forget. For more than 3 decades, almost nothing was known about that second process. Then, in the summer of 2010, a retired funeral home employee tried to sell a box of tools he said he had used on Elvis's body the night he died, and reopened a controversy that the Presley estate had spent 33 years trying to keep closed. Elvis's death triggered chaos almost immediately. Thousands of fans converged on Memphis within hours, many of them descending on Baptist Memorial Hospital before later regrouping outside the gates of Graceland. Reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers made it nearly impossible for hospital and funeral home staff to work without being watched. According to later reporting tied to the 2010 auction controversy, the funeral preparation team used a John Doe identification tag rather than Elvis's real name while his body was being moved and processed, a common practice funeral homes use to protect a high-profile client's privacy from prying eyes and souvenir hunters. That very tag would resurface publicly decades later, listed among the items a retired embalmer tried to sell at auction. Inside Baptist Memorial Hospital that afternoon, the scene was reportedly just as chaotic. Members of Elvis's inner circle, along with his personal physician, were present as the medical team made a final, largely symbolic attempt at resuscitation. By most accounts, it was already clear to the staff on the scene that too much time had passed for those efforts to succeed. Once Elvis was formally pronounced dead at 3:30 p.m., word spread through Memphis within the hour, and a mix of grieving fans, photographers, and reporters began gathering outside the hospital, then later outside Graceland itself, in numbers large enough to overwhelm ordinary hospital security. Elvis's body was ultimately taken to Memphis Funeral Home, where his father, Vernon Presley, had arranged for a custom bronze casket similar in style to the one used for Elvis's mother, Gladys, years earlier. The preparation work, dressing him in a white suit at his father's request, restoring his hair to its familiar jet black color after it had grayed in his final months, and applying the cosmetics needed for an open casket viewing attended by huge crowds, fell to the funeral home's senior embalmer and his small team. As with almost any embalming case, that work meant handling a set of standard mortuary tools: rubber gloves, forceps, needle injectors, an arterial tube, aneurysm hooks, lip brushes, a comb, and cosmetic eyeliner. On their own, these were unremarkable, everyday instruments of the profession, identical to what a funeral home would use on any client. What made them extraordinary, eventually, was whose body they had touched, and the fact that, according to what surfaced decades later, at least some of them were never thrown away. For over 3 decades, that part of the story stayed buried. Then, in July 2010, Chicago-based Leslie Hyman Auctioneers announced it would be selling 2 lots of items tied to Elvis's embalming and preparation, a post-mortem kit and an embalming kit, reportedly consigned by a retired senior embalmer from the Memphis funeral home who was in his 80s by that point. According to contemporary press coverage, he said he had kept the items, the tools, the coffin shipping invoice, the preparation room case report, and the John Doe toe tag, for more than 30 years before deciding, through his son, to offer them for sale. The auction was scheduled for August 12, 2010, deliberately timed just 4 days before the 33rd anniversary of Elvis's death, when Memphis traditionally fills with fans for the annual Elvis Week observances. The 2 lots were expected to bring in a combined total of roughly $14,000, about $8,000 for the embalming tool lot and $6,000 for the post-mortem materials. News of the planned sale spread quickly, in part because it was such an unusual departure from the guitars, stage costumes, and gold records that typically make up celebrity memorabilia auctions. This was something far more intimate and, to many, far more unsettling, the literal instruments used on a legend's corpse. The reaction from Memphis Funeral Home was immediate and furious. According to the funeral home's president, E.C. Daves, the items had been removed without the company's consent, and he publicly challenged both their authenticity and the embalmer's right to sell them. Daves noted that another former employee had told him the same category of instruments was routinely sterilized and reused on other clients, casting doubt on the claim that these specific tools had touched Elvis and no one else. Ownership was the bigger legal problem. Under standard employment and corporate law, tools and materials used by an employee in the course of company business generally belong to the employer, not the individual worker, meaning that even if the retired embalmer had genuinely used these instruments on Elvis in 1977, he likely never had the legal right to take them home or profit from them later. Memphis Funeral Home is owned by Service Corporation International, a large, Texas-based funeral industry conglomerate, and the company made clear it considered the items its property. Facing that pressure, the situation resolved quickly. Just days before the scheduled sale, the retired embalmer and his son agreed to withdraw both lots and turn the items over to Memphis Funeral Home and Service Corporation International, reportedly with the intention that they eventually be donated, possibly to a funeral history museum, rather than destroyed outright. Leslie Hindman Auctioneers confirmed the withdrawal and later the full cancellation of that portion of the sale. Dave said the funeral home did not intend to pursue any legal action against the embalmer in return, and that the ultimate fate of the items would depend in part on the wishes of the Presley estate. The auction never happened, and the tools disappeared from public view once again. The episode drew sharp criticism from within the funeral industry itself. Carl Kahn, president of the Worsham College of Mortuary Science in Illinois, argued publicly at the time that morticians occupy a position of deep trust with grieving families and are not supposed to profit personally from that work, famous client or not. He also voiced skepticism about the authenticity claims, a doubt echoed by others who covered the story at the time. Service Corporation International went further, issuing a statement calling the planned sale entirely inappropriate and framing it as inconsistent with the company's stated commitment to treat every family it serves, celebrity or otherwise, with privacy, dignity, and respect. Some commentators covering the story at the time noted a certain irony in a large corporation invoking dignity while also moving quickly to reclaim ownership of items that, authentic or not, had real commercial value. Leslie Hindman Auctioneers itself pulled the original sale listing from its website once the dispute became public, and by the following week the Chicago Tribune and other outlets confirmed the sale was fully off. Whether the instruments were truly authentic or simply ordinary mortuary supplies dressed up with a famous story attached, the controversy reignited a decades-old public appetite for anything connected to Elvis's final hours. It's also worth noting that the same auction house had, in the prior year, sold other Elvis-connected items without controversy, including a monogrammed shirt, wedding photographs, and even a lock of his hair, which alone had fetched around $18,000 at a separate sale. The embalming tools were simply a different category of object entirely, not memorabilia from Elvis's life, but physical evidence from the last night anyone spent with his body. The tools themselves, real or not, were never going to answer the biggest question surrounding Elvis's death: what actually killed him? That answer came, at least officially, from the autopsy performed at Baptist Memorial Hospital on the afternoon of August 16, 1977, led by a team that included Shelby County's chief medical examiner, Dr. Jerry Francisco, along with pathologists Dr. Eric Muirhead and Dr. Noel Florideau. That evening, Francisco told reporters that preliminary findings pointed to cardiac arrhythmia, an abnormal, ultimately fatal heart rhythm, as the cause of death, and stated that drugs did not appear to be a factor. The full picture that later emerged was considerably more complicated. Elvis's heart was found to be significantly enlarged, a common consequence of long-term high blood pressure and coronary artery disease, both of which the autopsy documented. Toxicology testing on his system reportedly detected somewhere around 10 different prescription drugs, mostly sedatives, painkillers, and other medications commonly prescribed to him. Even so, the coroner's office and its consulting pathologists ultimately concluded that there was no clear evidence the medications found in his body directly caused, or significantly contributed to, his death, a conclusion that many observers found difficult to square with the sheer number of substances involved. Elvis's medical history in his final years also included chronic constipation severe enough that some later medical writers have used the term megacolon to describe it, a markedly enlarged, poorly functioning large intestine. Physicians who have examined his case since have offered competing explanations. Some attribute it to long-term laxative abuse tied to his drug use, while others, including author and Elvis historian Sally Hodel, have argued it may have stemmed from an underlying genetic condition that affected his digestive system for most of his life, independent of any medication. Either way, it reflects a body under serious, sustained physical strain in the years before his death, alongside high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and what some retrospective medical reviews have characterized as diabetes-related complications. No account of Elvis's final years is complete without George Nichopoulos, known to almost everyone around Elvis simply as Dr. Nick. Nichopoulos began treating Elvis in 1967 and became his full-time personal physician by 1970, a relationship that lasted until Presley's death. Records later showed that in just the first 8 months of 1977 alone, Nichopoulos had prescribed Elvis more than 10,000 doses of amphetamines, barbiturates, narcotics, tranquilizers, sleeping pills, laxatives, and hormones, a staggering volume by any medical standard. Nichopoulos always maintained that his intentions were protective rather than reckless. He testified that he believed keeping Elvis's prescriptions under his own supervision, including secretly substituting placebo pills for genuine medication whenever he could get away with it, was safer than allowing Elvis to obtain drugs from other doctors or from the street. In 1980, Nichopoulos was indicted on 14 counts of overprescribing controlled substances, covering not only Elvis but the singer Jerry Lee Lewis and a dozen other patients. Local prosecutors reportedly ruled out murder charges given how divided the medical opinions on the actual cause of death were. At trial the following year, a jury acquitted him, apparently persuaded that he had been acting, however unconventionally, in what he believed were his patient's best interests. The controversy didn't end there. Years later, a television investigation renewed public pressure on the case, and the Tennessee Medical Board reviewed Nichopoulos's conduct again. This time the outcome was different. While the board did not find him guilty of unethical or grossly negligent practice in a criminal sense, it did find him guilty of improperly prescribing medication to 10 separate patients, Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis among them. His medical license was ultimately suspended, and in 1995 the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners made that suspension permanent. Nichopoulos died in Memphis in February 2016 at the age of 88, having spent decades as one of the most debated figures in the entire Elvis story. One detail routinely mentioned in almost every retelling of Elvis's death is that his complete autopsy findings remain sealed. This is true, but it deserves some precision, because the official public record and the sealed private record are two different things. The public death certificate, issued by Dr. Francisco within days of Elvis's death, listed cardiac arrhythmia as the official cause of death, a document that has always been a matter of public record. In 1982, when the ABC News program 2020 petitioned Tennessee's courts to force Shelby County's medical examiner to release the full underlying autopsy report, the state Supreme Court declined to compel its release. Separately, and largely because of how much public doubt surrounded the official cardiac explanation, Vernon Presley arranged for a second private autopsy on his son's behalf. The results of that private examination were sealed at the family's request, reportedly for 50 years, meaning they are set to become public only around the 50th anniversary of Elvis's death, August 16, 2027. That still pending release is why speculation about Elvis's true cause of death has never fully gone away. The most detailed, family commission findings have simply never been shown to the public. It isn't hard to understand why the Presley family wanted these details kept private for as long as possible. Vernon Presley, and later the wider Presley estate, had every reason to want the world to remember Elvis as the electrifying performer he had been for most of his career, rather than as a man whose body was quietly failing him in his final years. The autopsy findings, an enlarged heart, chronic prescription drug dependence, a digestive system pushed to its limit, paint a picture of a man in serious physical decline behind a carefully maintained public image. For a family trying to protect a legacy worth hundreds of millions of dollars in ongoing revenue, keeping that picture out of public view for as long as legally possible was, from a purely practical standpoint, an understandable decision. But secrecy has costs of its own. Because the full private autopsy has never been released, decades of conspiracy theories have filled the gap left behind, everything from faked death rumors to claims of government conspiracies. None of those theories have ever been supported by credible evidence, but their persistence is, in part, a direct consequence of how much information has remained locked away. The 2010 auction attempt fits into that same pattern. Whether or not the tools offered for sale were genuinely the ones used on Elvis's body that August night, the episode showed just how much appetite still existed, more than 3 decades later, for any tangible connection to his final hours. It also showed the limits of that appetite. Once ownership and authenticity were seriously challenged, the sale collapsed within days, and the items were quietly absorbed back into the funeral home's corporate custody rather than sold to the highest bidder. Strip away the auction drama, the legal wrangling over who owned a box of used mortuary tools, and the decades of tabloid speculation, and what remains is a more sobering story. Elvis Presley died of a heart that had been under years of accumulating strain, compounded by a level of prescription drug dependence that his own personal physician, whatever his intentions, had helped sustain. He was also, by multiple contemporary and retrospective accounts, dealing with serious digestive and metabolic health problems that he mostly kept hidden from the public. The retired embalmer's brief attempt to profit from his private collection of tools in 2010 didn't reveal any medical secrets about how Elvis died. The courts and the funeral home made sure of that by shutting the sale down before it could happen. What it did reveal was how fragile the boundary can be between private grief and public spectacle, even 33 years after the fact, and how much of Elvis Presley's actual medical story is still, as of today, waiting behind a seal that won't lift until 2027. Until then, what's known for certain is this: a global icon, worn down by fame, chronic pain, and a decade of heavy prescription use, collapsed in his bathroom on an August afternoon in 1977, and even now, some of the fullest answers about why remain locked away, 1 year short of half a century later. It also leaves an open question about the retired embalmer himself. He was never accused of any crime, and by the time his name surfaced publicly he was already in his 80s, decades removed from that August night in 1977. Was holding on to a set of used mortuary tools for 33 years, and eventually trying to sell them, a genuine breach of the trust his profession depends on, or simply an old man's attempt, however misguided, to hold on to a piece of history he happened to have been part of? The funeral home clearly saw it as the former, and the law appears to have agreed. Either way, by the time the 50th anniversary of Elvis's death finally arrives in August 2027 and the sealed private autopsy is opened, the embalming tools controversy will likely be remembered as a strange footnote, a reminder of just how far the world has always been willing to go for one more piece of the king.